Yes, good morning, everybody. Very happy to be here. I'm Louisa, as you just heard. I work for CNBC. It's a financial and business news television station, and I anchor for them, and I've been doing it for a long time, for 14 years now. And it was funny, I was talking to a friend of mine who runs a very large listed financial or non-listed financial institution, and we were talking about how it seems that the more you know, the more it feels like you don't know. Or the more you know, you don't know. So in other words, the more you know, the dumber you feel sometimes. And at the moment, it's not that any of us feel dumb, but when looking at what's going on in Europe at the moment, it's daunting. And it's daunting because we're in uncharted territories, as we hear all the time. We're coming up with solutions to the legacy that's left from the financial crisis. And it's just a bit muddy. And I just put together some of the things that I've been looking at over the last recent couple of days. I mean, I was speaking to a former governing councillor of the ECB yesterday who was saying we should have started with quantitative easing a long time ago. You had the classic risk-off environment seen just 2.5 weeks ago where there was just selling across all asset classes. That was pretty scary for some people who thought that the worst was behind us, and now we're starting to talk about whether or not we're going to have to see another leg down. Deflation, well, we talk about whether the Eurozone is going to be in a period of deflation. And in reality, what we're looking at, Greece, not Germany, Greece, Italy, Spain, Slovenia, and Slovakia are already in deflation. Greek bond yields shooting up to 9%. You saw yields coming off sharply, both in Germany and in the US as well. A lot of people questioning whether we'd see QE4 stateside as well. And there was also a rumor going around that we'd see the ECB step in and do corporate bond buying too. So there was a lot taking place. Portugal and Greece entering bear market territory, down by some 30% from their highs for the year. That happened also here 2 weeks ago. There was a Bundesbank report that Germany risks recession. James Bullard, the St. Louis Fed president, he was talking about how the Fed should delay the end of asset purchases given the softer inflation expectations. And of course, we'll know more from the FOMC this week. China's third quarter GDP data coming in at a print slightly above expectations. The IFO Business Climate Index was worse than anticipated, alongside with PS, a lot of the German data currently. We'll talk more about Germany because the data looks terrible. Riksbank surprising everybody, cutting rates this morning to 0. Does that mean other central banks are going to do the same? And then, of course, the AQRs and the stress tests that we happily covered here over the weekend. Interesting to note that not a single Spanish bank failed those tests. And also bearing in mind, some say Europe is healthy. Looking at the banks, some say it's not. Because the banks have more capital for the time being. I mean, this was a measure about, or again, exercise about balance sheet strength. Just because there's capital currently, does that mean that there's capital in the short to medium term? And on top of that, also, just with regards to the stress tests, there are a lot of things that they didn't measure for too. Just a lot to talk about. I mean, I feel like a kid in a candy store looking at the topics that we've been given today. So those are some of my initial thoughts with regards to Europe and some of the data points that I've been looking at, and some of the kind of the hot topics. I want to introduce my panel, an esteemed panel and the best panel that you're going to hear all day long. And here with me on stage, over here to my right, we have Howard Shore, Executive Chairman from Shore Capital Group. Next to him, Gerard Lyons, Chief Economic Advisor to the Mayor of London. Next to me, I have Nigel Farage, leader of the UK Independence Party and also a member of the European Parliament. And out here on the left, we have Helena Morrissey, CBE and CEO of Newton Investment Management. And I think we should kick it off with Europe, because no doubt we're going to come back and talk about the UK. So kicking it off with Europe and just looking at the first line in your book here, uncertainty about Europe's economic future is starting to look like a permanent condition. Is it a permanent condition? How do we get out of it? Howard.
Well, good morning and thank you. I said actually at the Milken conference in LA earlier this year, the biggest problems in Europe were France and Italy, and it's only got worse since then. The other thing that we talked about was the emergence of the Ukrainian crisis and sanctions and how that would impact Europe, and particularly Eastern Europe and Germany. Dealing with the first point, France and Italy, We had structural reforms in the 80s under Margaret Thatcher. She took on the unions, she broke the unions, and we had labour market reforms which allowed small businesses to take on people and the country to grow. In Germany, Schroeder did it consensually because the German society is more consensual and the unions are more consensual. What we have in France and Italy is extremely powerful unions and not much appetite to reform. The Italians are trying it. The first thing they're doing is trying to make people pay more tax, a higher proportion of the population contributing to the tax base. But they still have an incredibly inflexible labour market, very powerful unions, a bloated public sector. France has all of the above and haven't made any effort to deal realistically with the fiscal problems. So, in my opinion, if Europe is going to improve, the two largest economies in the Eurozone, outside of Germany, France and Italy, need to have structural reforms. So putting aside whether the ECB do this or that or the other, the countries need to change, people need to get back to work. The welfare states are bloated, but on the other hand, young people don't have job opportunities, and you need to change the system in order to give young people a chance to work and at the same time reduce the welfare state.
Aren't they doing that?
Not to the degree, anywhere near the degree they need to do that. Turning to the Ukrainian crisis, I think that's to some degree self-inflicted by Europe, in the sense that we started to approach Ukraine and suggest that we would provide a bailout when the Russians typically or historically had provided support to that country. Putin saw that as an attack, as an offence on his sphere of influence, and we've promoted a crisis. We're now in a situation where we have sanctions, and sanctions have definitely exacerbated the problem in Europe, particularly in Germany. We're seeing a slowdown in German exports. Clearly that's partly because of a slowdown in places like China, but it's also because of a slowdown in exports to Russia, and the whole region of Eastern Europe is suffering from a reduction in confidence. So at least that's one thing that we could address in the short term, which is trying to find a resolution with Putin so that sanctions can be withdrawn and to help the EU economy stabilise. In the medium term, the key to me is structural reform in France and Italy.
How does that sound to you, Gerard?
Yeah, well, good morning. Great pleasure, great honour to be here. Your question sort of touched on both the near term and the longer term. In the near term, Europe is basically suffering from a lack of demand. Deflationary pressures are mounting. Policy needs to do more. And Europe basically suffering from an economic model that frankly doesn't work in terms of addressing immediate issues. Whichever economy one looks at, or indeed whichever region one looks at globally, the outcome depends on the interaction between the fundamentals, policy and confidence. In terms of Europe, the fundamentals on the periphery are improving, and we shouldn't overlook that. So if you go to Spain, Ireland, they're a bit more upbeat. But the fundamentals still suffer from a lack of demand, a lack of spending. Policy, effectively in Europe, like in America, like in the UK, the central bank has become the shock absorber. And in that respect, the central bank can only do so much. But as you touched on in your introduction, talking about an ECB member, the European Central Bank effectively has to do more. Confidence is always the big unknown. We know in economic terms what can pull confidence down. We don't know what can boost confidence. But it doesn't seem to me that confidence is about to get an immediate boost on the continent in Europe. So economically, in the very near term, lack of demand, deflationary pressures, European Central Bank will have to do more. Difficult to be too optimistic. If we look beyond that, I'm pretty bullish about the world economy. If you think of a motorway, in the fast lane, the emerging economies are in the fast lane. Many of them are going at very different speeds. They're going through business cycles. India maybe past the worst, China slowing down. But the underlying story there is a positive one. America and Britain in the middle lane going from first to second, eventually to third gear, improving. Europe still in the slow lane, and unfortunately some of the economies there on the hard shoulder. But in the longer term, Europe needs to innovate and become more dynamic and address some of these supply side longer term issues. So in the near term, I think we should be cautious.
So that's structural reforms that are needed as well.
Structural reform, but yeah, you can. Look.
See, I'm still trying to figure out what are structural
Yeah,
reforms.
well,
I mean, we hear we need structural reforms, but
Okay,
Well,
Well, without-
35-hour week to start with in France.
Well, actually, it's quite interesting. France does very well
it's
on
like they're
many.
actually productive.
Yeah, they do
have high
very well on
productivity.
productivity. Without trying to monopolise the debate, the interesting thing is that this debate was held in Japan 20 years ago. And really, you have a demand side problem and a supply side problem. In Europe now, as you did in Japan then, you can't address a demand and supply side problem without both demand and supply side solutions. You can't put it all down to supply side reform. You need to actually have demand as well.
Okay. Helena.
So, to add to what's gone on already, I think our panel has actually talked about Europe at a crossroads, whereas I'd say actually we're facing a hole in the road. To echo everything that's gone on before, I think we have to stand back as well and look at the fact that when the UK joined what is now the EU bloc accounted for 37% of the world's GDP, and it's by the time we get to 2025, expected to only be 22%. And as well as all the malaise following the financial crisis, we've got some other hurdles in Europe. Obviously, the demographic situation is poor, aging population. So when we look at Europe relative to, say, some of the emerging markets, where there are, for India, for example, where much as a higher rate of younger people that can contribute, then that's a burden for Europe. But I have to, at this stage, and I'm obviously a warm-up act for Nigel, I have to draw a
You
connection.
are your own, Helena.
I know, I'm going to warm him up. So I have to draw a connection
I need
between...
calming down, actually.
Well, I'm going to rile him before I get started. But we have to make a connection, I think it would be remiss not to, between the economic malaise and the political construct of Europe. There's one of the problems that's impeded a faster, a more aggressive action post the financial crisis. And you look at what the US did and what the UK have done, they're much more quick to act. And that's partly because, of course, Germany has been the dominant force in terms of setting economic policy, and being the so-called powerhouse of Europe. It's only expected to grow 1.2% itself this year, so not really a powerhouse anymore. But obviously, Germany's and Angela Merkel's understandable insistence on fiscal austerity, on an interest rate that works for German economy and so forth, has unfortunately, given the construct of the EU and the fact that you've got monetary union within the Eurozone, but not political and fiscal union, meant that we're not running the right policies in other countries to allow the young people to be employed. So it's not, there's the two halves of the same coin in my view. The economic problems are a direct consequence as an old-fashioned, inappropriate political construct.
But shouldn't we also be able to distinguish between Europe should be, it's like a relationship. Just because you're in a relationship, you don't have to lose yourself. You can be together and be independent at the same time.
It's a provocative
right?
question because
No, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. Do we have to have this one-size-fits-all solution for everybody in
but
Europe?
the trouble is you do. The way that the Eurozone is set up, you have one legal system, so that 50% of our statute book is set by Europe. You can't opt out or pick and choose, or everybody has to abide by the same regime. And of course, when you had more looser currency, currency, the ERM, whatever that was called, but even that didn't work out too well. At least then you had bans, you had some flexibility. There's been no safety valve. There's been no way that, for example, Italy could have devalued its currency to stay more competitive. And so they've been
Can I just say
down more.
I know you're going through a list, but just 10 seconds.
I'm not going through a list, trust me.
Because I completely agree with what Helena said, but here in the UK we had a very detailed debate 15 years ago about whether Britain should join the euro. And everything Helena just said now basically was identified here in Britain then. And this is maybe the big issue. Here in the UK, we always look at this, it seems to me, from an economic perspective. But when you go to the continent or to Ireland, it's very much seen from a political perspective. And back in Britain in 1997, 98, it was felt that for the euro to survive, not only was one size fit all necessary, but a political union was almost inevitable. So there is that, it's not just economic, it's really political, as Helena really touched on, I feel.
But there was an economic tragedy that's resulting from it. So already we've talked about the young unemployed. 50% of young people in Spain are without work, and there's 26 million people across the Eurozone without a job. And that's the price that's being paid for this political experiment.
Nigel, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you. What great timing for this debate. Just a few days after the UKIP plant, Jean-Claude Juncker, gives us a bill for 1.7 billion.
But they knew about it earlier.
It's only in
The
the... It
ONS
is
knew about
actually...
it
It could only be, couldn't it, in the modern-day European Union, that financial readjustments mean that a country that has got nearly 60% youth unemployment is going to have to put a bit more money in to give to the Germans. I mean, what an incredible system we've set up. How are things going to improve? They're not. The model is wrong. Helena touched on it. The model actually is wrong. And I think it's wrong in two principal ways. Firstly, the idea that you can take all these disparate countries and put them together inside an economic and monetary union is madness. And I remember very well, and I mean, Gerard made the point when we were having our debate about this, we said, well, surely you have to have political union for this to work. What they thought in Brussels was, no, don't talk about that. Just talk about the wonderful economic benefits, and then as night follows day, political union will follow. That was what they believed inside the European Commission, because remember, the aim of this project is to create a United States of Europe. It is about the abolition of nation states and their replacement with a flag, an anthem, and a variety of presidents, most of whom we've never heard of. But that's what the project's actually about. And there were economists screaming, saying, look, you can make the argument, actually, that Germany and the Benelux countries and some bits of Scandinavia do constitute an optimal currency zone. And in pure economic terms, that can work. But the Club Med countries, are never going to fit inside of this. And the result has been a tragedy, an absolute tragedy. These countries stuck inside a currency they should never have joined in the first place. So how are things going to get better in Greece and in Cyprus and in Italy and probably in the end in France too? Simple, by the single currency blowing apart and not existing anymore. The second problem we've got, we can talk about becoming more competitive until we're blue in the face. We can talk about trying to compete with the Far East. None of it is worth a row of beans. And why? Because the political system that was set up very cleverly in the 1950s was set up to be beyond our democratic fingertips. We cannot change existing employment legislation in the member state countries. We cannot change health and safety at work rules. And we cannot change environmental rules because once something becomes a European law, it becomes part of the acquis communautaire, the body of law that is held by the European Commission. And there's nothing David Cameron, there's nothing the British electorate, there's nothing the French electorate, if they actually wanted reform, which I actually don't think they do. There's nothing any of us can do to change it. And so we found ourselves with this social market model, which may have been very good for our consciences in the 1960s and 70s, but actually leaves us increasingly uncompetitive against the rest of the world. And I would particularly point out what no one's mentioned. We've all talked about the summit last week and the 1.7 billion bill and Cameron banging his fist on the table. What everyone's forgotten is what was also agreed that day is that we would up the level that we're going to cut carbon dioxide emissions to 40%. So just at the very same time that the Americans have gone for shale gas, the Indians and Chinese are mining coal on a scale that we can scarcely imagine, we've decided that more wind energy and higher bills for our manufacturers is the answer. So my conclusion is that there is not going to be any resolution to the Eurozone. It will be a slow, long, lingering death. The Europe that I grew up in was split from east to west by the Berlin Wall, and it's now split from north to south by the Eurozone. The question is France a northern European country or a southern European country? And I think rapidly France is sinking further south.
I want to come back to you. Last night at the dinner, Eric Cantor and Mike Milken, they were speaking, and they asked in the audience how many of you are not from the UK. And I think it would just be helpful to see how many here are not from the UK this morning. So about half, more or less, right? More or less. So just bearing that in mind. with regards to some of the points that you just made, some people might argue that, well, Europe was also formed to maintain peace, for democracy. The single market has helped millions of people get jobs. We see a lot of beneficial trade routes having been set up, or trade, countries trading with each other. Germany alone, when you look at some of the trade relations out there, you have something like 1,500 companies in Germany that are British, something like between 200 and 250,000 people employed via those companies. Sizable FDI that goes back and forth. Haven't some parts of Europe worked? And isn't it just like a matter of we're making sausages now? And when you make sausages, you just have to keep going.
We're living in a global economy. All through GATT and the World Trade Organization, we've been through 4 decades of global trade liberalization. This has been happening all over the world, not just within the confines of the geography of the European continent. And actually, this is the only part of the world in which we say to each other, we have to be in a political union in order to buy and sell widgets from each other. Nowhere else in the world pretends that. So no, I think it's wholly unnecessary. And I think the single market, this much championed single market, which still even the Conservatives seem to believe in, well, this week, it'll probably change next week, but even the single market actually is the very thing that has given us this very over-regulated model. And if I could be selfish for a minute and just talk about the United Kingdom as opposed to the rest of Europe, being members of a customs union single market means that we, as the world's 6th or 7th largest trading nation, we're actually forbidden from making our own trade relationships with any other part of the world. In fact, we had a World Trade Organization meeting a couple of years ago where the British delegation was asked to leave the room. Nicaragua was still in there, but we were asked to leave the room. So the point is actually, far from this being something that is good for our overseas business, it's actually very inhibiting and very cloying on our ability to be a global trading nation. And Switzerland, just last quick point, little Switzerland, who negotiates her own trade deals, she's got more free trade agreements globally than we've got as members of the European Union.
Howard.
Well, I would certainly agree that if we were outside the EU, we'd continue to have full access to trade in the EU. I think the idea that somehow or other, if we left, we'd be penalised is fantasy. I think our trade deficit with Europe is over 50 billion. And with Germany alone is over 30 billion. So no one's going to embark on a trade war, and I do agree with Nigel that the Swiss model is much more preferential. Nevertheless, I do think the free market, the free trading zone that we signed up to, or we thought we signed up to in the 70s, in itself is a good thing. And I also think that it is possible to renegotiate because, for the very reason I just mentioned, the Germans particularly can't afford for us to leave. If we left the EU, for instance, and I'm actually in favour of leaving the EU, but I'm being practical about it, if we left the EU, our fiscal transfer at the moment is 8 or 9 billion. They want it to go up by 1.7 billion, whatever the number is. So it's going to be 10 plus. Who picks up the check if we leave on day one? Only Germany. So that's in itself not very attractive. Secondly, small matter about trade. And thirdly, the matter about destabilisation. So we can read in the FT, Angela Merkel says this or that or the other. I actually don't believe for a minute that we can't negotiate certain items that Nigel talked about. Thatcher did it in the 80s when France and Germany were very strong nations. Now the Eurozone is very weak and fragile. They need us as much, if not more, than we need them, and therefore they are vulnerable and they will have to renegotiate if that's the route that we want to take.
But Howard, that's economically, I'm completely with you. We are now the Eurozone's biggest export market in the world.
Yes.
The deficit, as you say, is about 45 billion a year, 200 billion over the last 5 years, and no sign of that changing. So I agree with you. Lord Digby Jones said, actually, you could get a free trade deal with the EU within 24 hours because the German car industry would demand that was the case. And I agree with that. But the renegotiation point, I disagree with you strongly. There are really, I mean, what this is coming to, and this is not where Cameron wanted to be, but it's where he's been pushed to. And it seems with each by-election that takes place, his line has to...
I wondered how long it was going to take to come to that.
Well, I mean, before Claxon, he'd never even talked about renegotiating the free movement of peoples. That had never even been on the... In fact, for his whole political career, he'd been a champion of the free movement of peoples. But the point is this, there are two things the Brits would need in a renegotiation. You know, being told we can catch herrings in Massoland or something like that just isn't going to cuss it.
I'm sorry.
And it really isn't. Well, you know, a minor cosmetic... Oh, you do? But a minor cosmetic concession isn't going to cut it. To win a referendum...
Some of
on
us like
continued
herring,
EU
by the way.
I do. I love them. I mean, don't misunderstand me. But we're going to need a different deal on the free movement of peoples, particularly with the ex-communist countries, and we're going to need a deal on the supremacy of law. And the point is this, Mrs. Thatcher at Fontainebleau, 30 years ago, swinging her handbag, she renegotiated something. What she didn't renegotiate was the treaty itself.
Yeah.
And Cameron's dilemma now is he's pushed to a position where the only renegotiation that can work is a fundamental treaty change. Are the Germans going to want to fundamentally renegotiate the treaty? I would argue no, and I think what we'll see from Germany is a very clear, pragmatic argument that the relationship with the United Kingdom post-treaty must be one simply of trade.
So I just want to thank the Milken Institute for putting me here as the only European on the panel. Everybody else is from the UK. And also, you're all Eurosceptics to a larger or a smaller degree. I just want to come to you, Gerard, because you wrote, or you looked at, you did a report. You wrote some papers. You did a report a while back. Yes. Where you looked at different options for whether or not we stick with the EU or not.
Yeah, okay.
And just talk us through a bit briefly the stress-tested options.
Well, the report can be accessed. It came out in August. The best scenario, in our view, at City Hall, it was a report for the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, but it was basically my view. The best scenario for Britain, the point being that the Mayor had to respond to it after. I thought, let's try and keep the politics out of this. The best economic scenario for Britain would be to be in a reformed European Union. But a very close second would be to leave. You need to be on good terms and you need to be thinking globally. But leaving and taking sensible global-orientated policies is far better than staying in an unreformed European Union. Now, the challenge is most economists would say, gosh, if you leave over the next 2 years, it would be terrible. The uncertainty ahead of any thought of leaving would deter people from investing. Yes, any change, even actually when you move to a bigger house, even if you're positive about it, it's disruptive. Any change is disruptive. So to make a correct comparison between being in and outside, you almost need to look at it over a couple of economic cycles. But let me quote two lots of three figures, just to sort of get to the essence. We didn't go into this in too much detail in the report, but 32, 62, 74. $32 trillion was the size of the world economy at the beginning of this century. $62 trillion was the size of the world economy the evening Lehman Brothers went bust. $74 trillion was the size of the world economy at the beginning of this year. These are cash figures, nominal figures. Businesses care about cash figures. So some of that is inflation, but the vast bulk of that is real economic activity. It's all about the fact that global economic cake is changing, it's growing, and Britain, London, Europe need to position themselves in that changing global economy. The other three sets of figures, very much come back to your original comments actually, are the ones that Chancellor Merkel used a few years ago, 7, 25, 50. Europe has 7% of the world's population, 25% of its income, so what Europe does really does matter, but 50% of its welfare spending. When Bismarck introduced the pension age in Germany, it was set at 70 and life expectancy was 59. The pension age subsequently came down to 65, but life expectancy is nearer 80. So there are deep-rooted problems. What many politicians on the continent find difficult is that to make the structural change often means you don't get re-elected. And in the report we did for Boris, it was saying, look, let's be sensible. What does Europe need to do? It needs to reform. It could take a few minutes to go through the reforms, but reform is possible, and it's all about whether Europe wants to reform. And Nigel touched on the key issue. Ever closer union is the key essence of the European Union. So there needs to be a mindset change. There needs to be a change thinking about Europe globally and how it positions itself globally. The single market you touched on needs to work. It doesn't work properly in services, which would be a big boost, I think, for anyone probably in this room who works in the financial sector.
But
And
can
there
I just say, Germany did reform.
Germany, you're right. 10
Germany
years
did
ago.
reform, and the effects of that have been a very, very stable. I think the word powerhouse was used earlier, but certainly a very stable economy in the heart of Europe. We do business in Germany. We have property business and telecoms business there. And what I've noticed most is the extent to which they train young people when they leave school. They don't all go to university. They train. And they have a fantastic apprenticeship system. And so when they come into the workforce, they really have a different mindset as well as a different level of training.
That's right.
It's also a more consensual society where, you know, they do have unions, but the unions are much more likely to bargain in a constructive way. And as a consequence, they're so much more productive. And so I think that, you know, I come back to the supply side. It's not just all about the macro. And of course, Europe is massively over-regulated. One of the biggest reasons I'm in favour of leaving the EU is the amount of regulation.
But Germany has a lack of demand at the moment, so it needs to spend.
I'm not sure. Can I just say, our experience.
No, I agree with everything you've said about the supply side.
It's not true about a lack of demand because what our experience certainly in
and they're not spending enough.
Well,
saving too much.
They save too much, but the domestic
that's a big issue.
The domestic side of the economy, I'd rather have too much saving than too little. But
well, then no one's going to spend.
Can I just say that at the moment, our experience, certainly on the real estate side, is the domestic economy is strong. People are renting more space at higher rents. What suffered is the export side. Now, I'm not saying if that's prolonged, it won't affect the whole economy. Exports are slowing down, partly because of what's happening in China, but partly because it's self-inflicted with the sanctions on Russia. And that's an easy fix if the politicians have an appetite to do it.
All three of you have now nicely warmed up. Helena, you're quoted as saying that the UK is better off if Britain leaves the EU, that enough is enough, let's leave the EU. The current EU is a model of the past. And we spoke briefly before this panel, very briefly, and you said something like, it's not an accident that Europe is in such trouble. And I thought about that afterwards, and I thought, but surely it's not on purpose either. I mean, if you look at the Great Depression, if you look at the oil crisis in the 70s, if you look at financial crisis, none of it's been on purpose.
No, but I think you still have to be honest at this juncture, and that's not what I see from Europe. I think there is a political agenda in terms of clinging on to the flawed experiment. Which has had its tragic consequences. And we go back to the question of reform. I frankly feel that we would be wasting valuable time that could be spent hopefully to more productive use. I mean, we've touched on regulation. There's been 3,500 new laws introduced by the EU since 2010. And if you work in the financial services, of course, you know, you're battling. We believe in strong regulation. But the starting point seems to me from Europe quite different from what we would be starting. The idea is to regulate and then see if we can fit business around it. Whereas I think we need to start with saying we need to do business, how do we control it? And it's a different mindset, it's a different philosophical approach. We want something quite different, it seems to me, at this juncture from what certainly the bureaucratic construct of Europe wants. Perhaps some of the country politicians, the national politicians, are more in our camp. But I worry at the moment that we're actually undermining our position within EU. We need to leave, if we are going to leave, on good terms. But at the moment, we seem to bicker and be perceived as difficult people. Whereas actually, I think we're being more honest about actually growth is going to come from very different dynamic. We're competing, as has already been said, in a global world. We're not competing with each other. And we need to focus on the bigger picture.
Can I just ask, I'm conscious of the time, and I just want to make sure that, I just lost my train of thought there.
The audience gets a chance?
No, yes, I was going to ask the audience in a second. No, yes, I want to make sure that we get to your investment opportunities as well, because even if, let's say that Europe is a failed project, let's say that people agree on that, and that there is no more Europe in 10 years or in 5 years. Well, we still have 5 years in the meantime, or 10 years in the meantime, and even after, if it were to split, you still are going to see investments in Europe. It's not like people are going to stop buying Europe. So I just wanted to hear, like, where are the opportunities in Europe? Where should we be putting our money? Should we be putting it to use at the moment? I mean, you're currently in Germany, but why? I mean, Germany, the atrocious figures there.
Well, first of all, in Germany, we have a very long-term approach. We're involved in real estate, and the good news is actually, as a consequence of the weakness in the Eurozone, interest rates are incredibly low, and the system is flush with liquidity from the ECB. So we can borrow 7-year money at 2.25%. So if you're an asset owner in that environment, it's wonderful. We're also obviously in business in the UK. My biggest concern in the UK is the political uncertainty, the next election, who wins it. If we get Miliband, it would be an unmitigated disaster. Quite happy to be quoted on that, unmitigated disaster.
It's one or two witnesses, anyway.
Yeah. Okay, so
we'll
German
get away with
hard
that.
assets, I'm hearing. Helena?
Yes, so News Invest globally, we're just trying to pick companies that are global winners. And there obviously are some great companies in Europe. But we would tend to be looking at those companies with international markets that we feel have got an edge. There obviously are very specific sectors. I mentioned ageing populations. There obviously tends to make us favour, for example, pharmaceutical and healthcare companies in Europe itself. So yes, obviously we look at each company, but we don't just invest geographically. We're not saying, oh, which country.
European financials?
Avoid them like the plague. So, that could be unambiguous in that. I mean, asset quality review would call another questionable result, really. I mean, it's just not.
Before I open up to
transparent.
questions, Nigel.
Be short of France. No, I'm being serious. The country's in real trouble, and it gives me no pleasure to say that. I love France, but it's, I remember in sort of early mid-70s when I was young, the sort of general feeling of depression in Britain, a feeling that it was all over. We were done for. The sick man of Europe, the 3-day week, the power strikes, the miners bringing down the government. And that's exactly how France feels. I've been all over France in the last couple of years, and the place feels very unhappy, very miserable. The political system is basically broken. The centre-right party is in tatters. Hollande is doing the same to the Socialist Party. The Front National, despite some really genuinely unpleasant elements, is very much on the rise. And I think that as a French presidential election approaches, if things continue on this course, we may well see at least the prospect of a speculation of Marine Le Pen running on a ticket that is not Front National, but is running on a ticket that is Marine Le Pen. She could become the next French president. And if she does, you can forget about the debate on race. Let's talk economics. She seems to be even more protectionist and even more socialist and even more statist than anything France has yet produced. So be sure of France.
Yeah.
What would you advise the mayor at the moment?
Perhaps it's no surprise, given what Nigel said, that London currently is the 4th biggest French city in the world in terms of French people living there. In terms of investment, well, I think interest rates will stay low in the UK and on the continent. Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, is consistent. He says rates stay low, rates go up gradually, rates peak at a low level. Maybe eventually rates might have to peak at a high level, but that might be 7 years down the road. But rates stay low, go up gradually here in the UK. The ECB, the balance sheet of the ECB is about twice the size of the European economy. Balance sheet of the Bank of England's over 4 times the size of the UK economy. Balance sheet of the Fed is 4 times the size of the US economy. So the ECB, despite German opposition, will have to do more. So interest rates stay low, yields across the yield curve will stay low. Currencies will be interesting. The balance sheet of the ECB expands. You would expect the euro to depreciate. UK politics, I think, will play in part. Liam Hannigan from the Sunday Telegraph's in the audience. Last weekend, he was pointing out current account deficit in the UK, a record high, 5.2% of GDP, 32% of gilts owned by the Bank of England, 42% owned by foreigners. So maybe sterling will be heavily influenced by the election. Beyond that, I think there are so many investment opportunities, particularly here in London. And Boris Johnson would be very keen for me to stress that. Helena has touched on the regulatory side. The regulatory side, unfortunately, is not only impacted by the continent, but also by here in the UK as well. And 1/5 of the London economy is financial sector. In some respects, Germany is benefiting from the global infrastructure boom. London and the UK is at the next stage of business, professional, financial services. But Med City, Tech City, doing really well here in the UK. So lots of specific investment opportunities. And I think the UK economy actually will do just fine over the next 20 years.
So in yes or no, you think the ECB should push ahead with QE?
I think the ECB should do as much as possible, as soon as possible, and the Germans might not like it, and that makes it complicated.
What do you think, yes or no?
I don't think it's going to address the real issue, which is we need structural reform, less regulation, more opportunity for young people to find jobs.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
economic solutions is just one part of it.
Just prolonging the agony. Those Mediterranean countries should never have joined the euro. They need to leave the euro, and they will.
Yes or no?
Not much to add to that, but yes, they can do the quantitative easing, but I don't think it's going to be more than marginal impact.
Okay. Bearing all that in mind, let's get to your questions as well. Great panel here, some very interesting voices. So we'd love to include you in the debate, the discussion. I see a hand over there. And just say who you are.
Hi, Wahid Chamas, a portfolio manager covering Europe at Janus Capital. Great discussion. Agree totally with the whole fiscal reform agenda, but a lot of what you guys discussed today is quite long-term, systemic, and structural. And I think we have a sick child here in Europe that really needs urgent help. And while quantitative easing at these levels of rates might not necessarily help, what they do is help with inflation expectations. And my question is, many countries have had a hard time passing reform, including the US. But what they've done is the central banks have at least given a lift to inflation expectations to stop this downward spiral. My question is, Mario Draghi, who has done so much, continues to come under attack. And I'm surprised that nobody on CNBC or anywhere has actually called for Weidemann's resignation, because the guy has gotten pretty much all his statistics wrong, all his forecasts wrong, and the Bundesbank does exactly what they please, make life very, very difficult.
I'll book you as a guest if you want to come on. Right. You can call for it.
The problem is if I call for resignation, nobody cares. But if somebody from prominence has to start calling accountability, and I want to get your perspective on how we politicians, business community, can actually help Mario Draghi at least stop the sick child from dying.
If we were to get rid of people and sack people because their financial forecasts were wrong, there'd be nobody left anywhere, would there? Including this government. So it doesn't really work like that. Draghi, I suppose, could be credited, with having made the comment a couple of years ago that we will do whatever it takes. That probably for then did stem the flow of what looked like another desperate.
Yes.
Downward movement, and with the possibility of more bailouts or bail-ins. So I think Draghi does have, if I'm being, forget my opinion, but within the European Parliament, within the European Commission, within Brussels itself, Draghi at the moment is one of the few respected figures.
And do you think he has full authority right now? You don't think it's getting compromised by this relentless German pressure?
Well, I think the architecture of Europe is very complicated, isn't it? This system of the Commission, and I talked earlier about the acquis communautaire and the way that the Commission has the sole right to propose legislation, and once it's passed, it owns it. The European Parliament, which is effectively like the House of Lords, we can delay things, we can amend things, but we can't initiate law. The Council of Ministers, and then ultimately, of course, the Court. So it is a very complicated system of lawmaking, and the ECB sort of fits in there somewhere. But the reality is, when the crisis hit in 2008, the people that were in charge, the two top dogs, were Mr. Barroso, the former Maoist, and well, I think it is relevant. Actually, 6 of the new European Commission that were voted in last week were former members of the Communist Party. I think this is relevant in terms of their thinking about central control of the European economy. And the other guy, of course, that was in charge was my very good friend from Belgium, the first ever permanent president of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy. And they were the top dogs. These two people that were... In fact, Van Rompuy's poll rating in terms of recognition in Britain, before I called him a damp rag, was 1.5%, and that was optimistic on a good day and rounded up, in my view.
But so...
And after I'd finished, 3% knew who he was, so he should have been paying me for doing it, really. But the point is, these were the guys in charge. These were the guys in charge facing the crisis, facing the bailouts, and, you know, whatever their lack of personal leadership skills, the fact they'd never been elected actually meant they had no credibility. And so what has happened is, since 2008, the Germans run Europe now. And what the Germans say, go. And getting back to your question, and the question that we've all debated, in terms of what should the ECB, what powers should Draghi be allowed to have, it's Chancellor Merkel that will decide that and nobody else.
Okay.
Well, can I just say, I mean, how much, Gerard would probably know the stat, how much have they got on deposit at the ECB, the Germans?
I want economists.
Several hundred billion.
Yeah,
so if I had several hundred billion on deposit, I'd also want the biggest say. So it's no surprise they've got the biggest say.
Yeah. You see, it's... Look, coming back to fundamentals, policy and confidence, some people might say we're being overly pessimistic. So let's look at it a different way. What would need to happen to make us really positive about Europe? Clearly, policy needs to do more on all dimensions. Confidence might start to recover if people and businesses start to see better signs at home, America pick up, China stabilise, which I think it will happen. But what needs to happen at home in Europe, we need to see bank lending pick up. Will that happen after the asset quality reviews? That's the big question. I'm not convinced. We need to see demand pick up in terms of wages picking up. Again, difficult to say. Really, we have what I would call the balanced economy paradox. It'd be like if all of us went to the bar after this and all of us decided to keep our hands in our pockets or in our handbags for our own personal financial reasons, and the Milken Institute decides not to buy any drinks. Then no one would drink. That's the reality. And what we have in Europe is this balanced economy paradox. The periphery are being forced to balance their economies. And they're doing it for political reasons because they think that's the only game in town. But the economies that have the ability to spend think, why should the good become like the bad? And they're not spending. And the reality is, if no one spends, no one drinks. If no one spends, no one consumes.
Okay.
I just add, I think that, because, you know, we have been quite pessimistic, and you can see the background to our views, but I think it's not just the UK that has called for some flow back of power to the nation states as well. I think this balance between a central command and control, one-size-fits-all Europe that is ultimately so destructive. So whatever Mario Draghi does, all he can do is to stop the euro itself from collapsing, but he can't engineer growth, I don't think. And to get growth, we need quite a radical rethink, which I just don't see coming.
Okay, other questions? Yes. Oh, that depends.
Okay. You're the only European there.
Yes.
I notice in the little book it says structural reform has begun to bear fruit, has it? And it says that the strength of populist parties, which I assume means Mr. Farage's party.
Yeah. I think she meant popular, actually. But anyway,
I'm not sure what a populist party is.
they have to be rude about us all the time.
Are they going to abort the efforts for structural reform?
You're asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking. You're the only European there. And as a panel,
Well,
we know what they
I definitely have my own opinions, definitely, but in my role, I prefer to stay completely neutral to that.
Yeah.
I was actually going to just go question by question and get some answers to precisely some of the blurbs in here, because I think the blurbs are actually very good. And then we took another tangent. But I think we should come back and ask some of these questions, though, in terms of whether or not the strength of the populist parties across the continent are going to abort the efforts of structural reform. Do you consider yourself populist? Do you say,
this is Barroso started this, because I had this remarkable situation for the last 10 years where I sit in seat number 20 on the front row of the European Parliament in Strasbourg, and dear old Barroso was in seat number 21, about sort of 6 feet from me. So I got to know the chap quite well, and I must have got under his skin because he started to attack populist parties. And what really got them was after the French and Dutch rejected the European Constitution and they rebranded it the Lisbon Treaty and thought, cool, blimey, governor, that's fine, it'll go through now. The Irish had a referendum and said no, and that was when it started. We will not bow to populism, is what Barroso said and Schultz said, and they all said. And parties like mine were branded populist. What it means is they will not bow to democracy. They will do whatever they can to ignore the peoples across this continent. And in the end, this is going to break. It cannot work. You cannot go on ignoring people and putting them inside a totally artificial national construct.
And I mean, I'm sure you saw what the 30% of the European vote went to in the recent parliamentary elections. European parliamentary elections went to so-called anti-European parties. I think it's an important point that you raise in twofold. One is I don't think we would need to worry about the lack of structural reform if we had different parties elected, because we haven't really got much structural reform at present. And secondly, I think it does show you can have more, and I'm not accusing UKIP being like this, but extremist parties are rising as a logical further consequence of the economic malaise. At the moment, there have been riots from time to time, but it's been somewhat contained. And yet if you have a whole lost generation that can't get a job and is at 40 years old and never had a job, then you're going to have a very different dynamic, which is quite incendiary, I think. And that's the logical limiting case of what we're on about today. So.
But I would say, though, I mean, I do think it's important to kind of divide the discussion into two and to say, well, we can talk about what to do about the aftermath of the financial crisis separate to Europe as a whole. And there are a lot of things about Europe that I personally think have worked, and I think a lot of people would agree have worked as well. And it's also about democracy, it's about peace, it's about, what type of an environment do you want? Do you want to live, with what type of government rule? So I mean, I think it's a fascinating question. Here, take a microphone just so people can hear. Sorry, say what again?
I think a lot of the people who think these things have gone well are in the media, rather than in the population as a whole.
So you don't believe in Europe?
No, I absolutely don't believe in Europe.
But that's interesting. Why?
And I'm interested that you should say you don't believe in Europe, because Europe is not a religion.
No.
No, it's not something you have faith in.
Oh, it is in Brussels.
No, but it's also the only thing that's sure in life is change. And if we don't change, and if we don't change with the changes that are happening, then we may as well give up on all projects that we start as well. So it's also.
No, but at a certain point you have to change the project. If it's not working, and that's the problem.
But I guess my question is, shouldn't there be a middle ground where you'd be able to maybe do some of the structural reforms, or you'll be able to change some of the things in treaties and still make it evolve to be a win-win situation for everybody?
Well, I do come back to my experience in Germany, where I would say the overwhelming proportion of Germans are very comfortable with the European project.
That's because they're in charge, though.
No, I don't think so. I think it's cultural. I think it's because of what happened in the Second World War and that desire for good relations with neighbours. And I think initially, for a few decades, actually, they let France dictate and get a better deal. But they did it for political reasons. And I think the Germans do sign up. So I think there are differences in different nations in terms of our appetite.
There's a whole host of issues here. One of the big worries, speaking to businesses across here in London at the moment, is not the perceived issue of whether Britain leaves the EU or not. It's the current reality of the Eurozone versus the non-Eurozone. And the fact that within the financial sector, more and more regulation, more and more issues have been driven with the Eurozone in mind. When Ireland joined the EMS, it was nicknamed in Dublin, easy money soon. And the euro is fundamentally flawed, and people need to understand it. In the good times, the money goes from the core to the periphery. It goes to high-yielding assets in Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Italy, because they're seen as being as safe as in Germany, yielding higher returns, no currency risk, feeds asset bubbles. In the bad times as now, the money flocks back to the core. Those places then go from boom to bust. And then we have EMU, even more unemployment. That's what it really stands for. No one's spending, an inability to address the issues. And I really think it comes to, can we get quick wins? We need to have more spending the ECB needs to do more. But maybe the issue, I'd like to hear the other panelists' view, is what's the longer-term strategic vision? My view of the general public is the general public aren't stupid. They put up with pain if they see it as being sensible. If they don't see any light at the end of the tunnel, they ask why. We need to have a vision of where London is, where Britain is in the changing global economy. I think we articulate that really well here in the UK. That's why I'm confident that Britain would do well outside the EU, but also it would do well if we helped reform the EU. But where does Europe have a longer-term vision? That's the key issue.
I know the panel members are dying to jump in here, but are there other questions to get ready while we just get a comment here? I know you had a comment on that?
Well, I'm not sure that it's for us to say to Europe, this is your vision for yourselves. I mean, I do see that if nothing changes, that it's not just the UK that is going to be questioning whether it belongs. But obviously in Greece now, ahead of the next election, you're seeing suggestions made by a party that could end up in power of a 50% haircut to the debt, which may be what Greece needs. But it obviously would be a big shock for the markets and have a rethink. Yeah. And I actually think we kind of need to talk about those bigger issues. But at the moment, I see Brussels as in denial still.
And Euroscepticism is growing everywhere, and it's growing on the right, the centre, and the left, and even in Germany. I mean, it's very interesting. You talked about Germany, and Ireland. You know, the German guilt was such that the European project and their positive role in it was a way of them showing the world that actually they're rather good people. But even in Germany, you know, Alternative for Deutschland, who are the least populist party I've ever seen in my life, because they're very intellectual in terms of their approach to the electorate, and they're now in double-digit scores. They're winning seats in regional elections. They've won seats in the European Parliament. So actually, this Eurosceptic trend is happening everywhere.
Can I just add, coming back to the point about, Gerard mentioned London. I mean, London's an extremely strong, vibrant economy, which is, to some degree, supporting the rest of the economy. We do have some very positive things in the UK, like 4 of the 6 top universities in the world on recent league tables, emerging biotech industry, etc., etc. But there's a massive regional divide, and we haven't done enough about people outside of London, job opportunities, and I come back to the lack of training, our educational standards. And so if Britain wants to prosper, we need to address those things.
Questions? Yes.
Regarding the investment opportunities in Europe, I'm wondering why nobody mentioned about the fantastic opportunities in distressed debt and private equity investments that are happening everywhere, especially the American and some of the UK private equity and hedge funds are making a kill in Europe right now. I am an environmental lawyer and private investor, and I am actually Greek by origin, although a UK resident for 20 years. And just wanted to say that most people in Greece are very many people in Greece are against the EU. If it was left to us, we would vote against the sanctions in Russia. We don't want to, we as a country, we have much affinity with Russia, so we're very much against what's going on, like dictated by Germany, putting sanctions on Russia and making a lot of the Greek enterprises and the economy suffer because some idiots in Brussels decide, you know, to put sanctions on Russia, and we suffer because of that.
Very good comment. Unfortunately, this is the last comment. You each get 30 seconds to wrap up.
Europe needs to change dramatically to compete in the global arena. It is possible, but we need political leaders who've got the appetite to do it, a la Margaret Thatcher. That's what we need in France and Italy.
Look, my comment has to be influenced by what you previously said in your previous answer, because you slightly put the boot in on London. Given my role, slightly. I'm saying that the regional issue. Actually, last year, the European Commission did a really interesting analysis. Where are the most competitive regions in Europe? So this is from Brussels. 3 of the top 5 are in the south of England. In 5th place, Surrey and Sussex. 3rd place, Buckinghamshire, Bedfordshire and Oxfordshire. 2nd place, London. Interestingly, Utrecht was 1st. But the reason Surrey, Sussex and those other places are vibrant, dynamic, was because they're linked to London. So it is possible to, and the lady asked a question, it is possible to find opportunities either in the investment sphere or in the economic sphere, despite everything.
And this is not sponsored by Dove. But Nigel.
I'm going to say this to you. The European project is a post-war project designed to bring warring states together around the table, and in that it was a laudable and sensible thing to do. But before anyone knew what was happening, they'd foisted upon us a treaty. And that treaty's been updated and amended several times. And we can sit on this panel and talk to a blue in the face about reform and change and new leaders in Europe. None of it will make any difference unless there is fundamental treaty change. And I do not see that treaty change. Even the prospect of Britain leaving will not mean the French and Germans will want treaty change. So I think the whole thing politically is, frankly, it's done for. And the sooner it breaks up, the better. And then perhaps we can have a Europe, a more sensible Europe, a Europe that has a free trade area, a Europe that has cooperation, a Europe that has reciprocity, but not political union.
And that was God interjecting.
What I
I
wondered
know, it
about
was
that.
a bit of clap of thunder there. Well, the only thing, I'm going to take the counter view to you, Louisa, in terms of how much I welcome having this discussion in the heart of the city, because so often the party line in the city is we don't want any change. The last debate I was on, there were 6 of us. I mistakenly thought that meant 3 each side, and I was the only Eurosceptic. There is a lot to discuss, and we need to elevate the conversation in this country to being actually about the future for this country. So I hope that we've done a little bit in that regard, but that it may be the first of many.
They say that if you're the smartest person in a room, then you're in the wrong room. And I hope we've all been in the right room this morning, learning from each other. And so thank you very much, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. You see, we're not in the minority anymore. Things are changing.